delighted to be joined this afternoon by Mark Prisk, who's had a long and illustrious career in politics, but also been a very good friend both to our industry and to the BPF during that time and since. So really looking forward to chatting to him about life in politics, perhaps before politics, in politics, and after politics. So I think it should be a fascinating half hour, and I hope you'll all enjoy it. So Mark, let me kick off by just asking you about that decision to move into politics. Perhaps, what is it that motivates someone? I mean, I couldn't do it. I could not put myself up to be, crawled over by everybody, scrutinised, challenged, and put yourself through that, election night kind of, feeling. So what is it that motivates someone like you to go into politics?
Well, thank you, Melanie. And I think for me, it was going back into the 1970s, so in the mists of time now, and it was a period as a teenager I became more aware perhaps of politics than you might otherwise have. So we had the 3-day week, we had blackouts. I remember those as a child, that the lights went out at a certain time, sort of 5 or 6 o'clock in the day, and in sort of January, February time, that meant it was dark. So I became aware of politics at a young age, and I kind of felt, I think the way I put it is, you can either be on the side of the pitch watching the other people participate and play, or you can get on the pitch and participate and contribute yourself. And I just wanted to get on the pitch and play. And I kind of felt, it's of course one feels one wants to make one's society a better place or have a particular role in an aspect. But it was that idea that one could be a participant rather than just a spectator that encouraged me to want to get into politics. To be fair, my parents said, that's fine, Mark, as a teenager, that's great, but maybe you might want to have a plan B. And actually that was a good idea, because it led me into taking my management at the University of Reading and then going on to being a surveyor. And I kind of felt then, when I did actually enter Parliament as an elected member, that I had a foundation, if you like. I had knowledge from which I could speak. And very often when you stand up in the Commons, there are people there who know far more about the subject than you do. So having something that's a grounding, and the property world is great in that sense. It leads into issues around housing. It leads into what kind of town centres do you want? What kind of communities? It leads into infrastructure discussions. So it's actually quite a good foundation, I think, for being a useful participant in politics. And so that was really what drew me into it in the first place.
Thank you, really interesting. I should have said at the start, please do use the Q&A function to ask your questions of Mark. I've got enough to go on for several hours, not just the half hour, but we'd really like to hear from you and answer the questions you'd like to hear more about. So please do use that Q&A function, and I will pick up your questions as we go along. So you've got the call. Is there a picture of a young Mark Prisk, sort of a la William Hague, that sort of seminal picture of him, age 16, addressing the Tory Party conference? Is there a similar photo in the Prisk album?
Well, not quite as famous as William, though thankfully with more hair, he won't mind me saying that. But I think a similar ambition, but I came out of university and got involved. I started at Knight Frank's when they were Knight Frank and Rutley many years ago, 83 in fact, on the commercial side. And I got involved in Westminster City Council politics and the local Conservative Party at that stage, also in think tanks. And I think these days, actually, the opportunities for young people to participate, not necessarily on a party basis, but in the general policy debate through think tanks, is much broader than it was in my day. And it's certainly an avenue that if people who are listening to this are interested, there's a range of really good think tanks from all the different political persuasions that you can get involved in. It's a good avenue, I think.
And did you come into political life sort of wanting to specialize in issues relating to property, or did you have other, were you interested in health or education? I mean, because you ended up pretty much pigeonholed into, kind of financial and business and, related roles.
I didn't go in on that basis, but I think what tends to happen is you start by trying to speak on the areas that you feel most confident about, and inevitably that tends to be the areas you have experience of or knowledge about. I think then when I was drawn onto the front bench, so I was elected in 2001 and was asked to join the front bench in 2002. And what that means in plain English is asked to speak on behalf of your party when you're in opposition as the counter to whichever minister is in place. So I started in the Shadow Treasury team with Michael Howard, who was then the Shadow Chancellor, and then worked through a number of roles. And you're right to say that I think people then in the Commons and commentators start thinking, oh, now this is somebody who, if they do reasonably well in a particular job, knows something about that. The downside of that is that politicians on the whole at senior levels generally prosper better when they're able to cross almost into any subject. And so I think probably it meant that the chances of me getting into cabinet were always small, and I wasn't sufficiently ambitious or driven enough to want to necessarily go guns blazing, as it were. What I did want to do was to focus on those areas I thought I could make a difference. So the reform of stamp duty, land tax was one thing I had to deal with as an opposition minister and spokesman. You tend to get drawn into those details. I actually think that's quite good, because then you understand how things work out in the real world.
And were you able at that time to continue your links with the industry, so that you could, kind of get yourself briefed by them, you could understand what was going on? Was there a problem with that, or was that still an easy thing to do?
No, I certainly tried to do that, and I mean, to be fair, it was never difficult if you were a member of Parliament. If you were interested, if you asked somebody if they would pop in and talk to you about what was going on, the people were always wanting to come to the Commons in that sense. But I also liked getting out and seeing things on the ground. And as a good constituency member of Parliament, you should be drawn into many of these issues. And actually, it's a wonderful opportunity to find out about all sorts of aspects of our lives, particularly from the constituency, where you will deal with almost every aspect as people bring their issues, and as different industries emerge. So in my constituency, pharmaceuticals in the form of GSK, very, very important employer. And therefore, that was a good opportunity for me to learn about that. So I think if you have a curious mind and are interested to find out why and how and where and when, then you can learn a heck of a lot about just being, open to what's going on in your constituency, as well as the sort of national picture.
And do you think that's more difficult now? I promise you I'm not going to ask you, about how many people text you privately or WhatsApp you privately, but, is that more difficult now, do you think, in your observation? Did it become more difficult for you, and is it more difficult now to do that?
Well, I think, and there's always been this tension around the relationship between commercial interests lobbying for what they want and the need for parliamentarians to be connected to the world outside of Westminster. And there will always be a tension, because some people will abuse it, albeit very often a minority. Some will just be slightly foolish, I think, and so I think you're right. The scrutiny is greater. That's fine. That's good. I think it could be better still. But equally, I think we would be very foolish if we made our parliamentarians politicians only. I like the fact that you can have former members of the armed forces, teachers, surveyors, in my case, people who've done something before they come to Parliament. I think that's really important. And so therefore, we've got to be careful not to make a sort of a class of politicians who know nothing about the outside world. That I think is a risk. So whatever rule changes should be made, it should allow that dialogue to continue in an effective way.
Thank you. So let's talk about your time as a minister then, because that's kind of, opposition is hard work, right? And being a minister is when you've got a bit of power, and that must be more fun, isn't it?
Yes. It is. The workload was tremendous. We came in 2010, so coalition government, no money, as we know at the time. And of course, we were having to work out the dynamics of a coalition relationship. So my immediate boss when I was the Minister of State of Business was Vince Cable. We got on perfectly well as individuals. Obviously, there were party tensions, but my view was there was a job to be done. At that point, the financial crisis loomed very large, and we just needed to get on and do the job. And I think, to be fair, that coalition government actually, was stable, and it delivered quite a lot in the time it had. It is great, though, however, to be the minister, because you have a good team of civil servants, and again, there can be some good and not so good individuals, but on the whole, all wanting to do the right thing, and some outstanding individuals. And I think I took the view that because my brief was huge, it was all the various business sectors, deregulation, the whole regional economic agenda, and for a few months, 6 or so months, the whole trade agenda as well. I needed to keep working across the whole waterfront, which probably prevented me from dipping too much into any one area. But no, it is. If you have a curious mind and a desire to get stuff done, then it is immensely energizing, actually.
So, thinking about your time at the business department, we'll come on to housing in a minute.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, every business sector I've worked for or talked to has always felt that government A, doesn't understand them, and B, doesn't listen to or prioritise their particular interests. Even the automotive industry sort of appears to feel like that. How they possibly could escapes me. So, but I mean, was property, real estate on the radar of the business department? Did you at the time you were there?
Well, I was responsible for the construction sector, for example. I think part of the problem is that property falls into a number of different bailiwicks in terms of departments. The risk, therefore, is that it isn't solely the responsibility of a minister. So the housing minister is involved, but so are parts of Treasury, and so are BIS, and so are other parts of DEFRA, and so on. So the risk, I think, and the problem has always been for property, is that because it runs across different bits of Whitehall, there isn't a sense of ownership by a key Secretary of State or a minister that makes them feel that this is the point of the person we need to talk to. And I think that presents a problem. So making sure that the sector in different parts of Whitehall is able to unite and have a clear single voice is very important. On the whole, I thought, for the most part, the different professional bodies did work together. But as a minister, if all you can hear is a cacophony of different voices, then you tend not to be able to hear the message. So you get on with it and do what you want. If there's a clear, united voice, I mean, you know this, there's a clear, united voice, then as a minister, you're getting very clearly that the key people around that sector have a clear view and opinion of what the direction should be. And that helps you as a minister because you know that you're not going to wade into something and find that actually half of the people you're trying to help don't want your help. It's those sorts of tensions that are important. And I think that's why, for example, with business rates at the moment, it is a tricky one because business rates is partly BEIS, there's a bit of MHCLG, but actually it's also really Treasury. And so it is a difficult animal to bed down.
Oh, Jeff, I better tear up my last question then, which is what's the answer to the business rates crisis challenge?
We'll see how we do.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so then let's think about housing. So I mean, housing, you can tick the first box that you've just been talking about, which is that everybody recognises, I think, that we need to build more homes, and those homes need to be of good quality, and people need a decent place to live. So there's, at least that far, we have a united and common message.
Yes.
But it feels like it breaks down quite quickly after that and becomes quite challenging. So how do you approach? Were you pleased to be appointed as the housing minister, and how did what was the starting point for you? What were you told was the brief for the new housing minister?
I think is a good point here. Very often, just because you're the housing minister doesn't mean that you've been given exactly the same brief to your predecessor or your successor gets. So I was told quite clearly by Eric Pickles, my boss then, that my role was to focus on new development. And other things like building regulations and so on were given to Don Foster, I think, who was one of my Lib Dem parliamentary undersecretaries. So there's a presumption that because you're the housing minister, you deal with everything on housing and planning. Not so. Indeed, Nick Bowles was the planning minister at the time. So that's important because although it sounds like minutiae, if your brief is quite specific, it does allow you to focus on that. So my approach was we'd had 2 years in, the housing market was still very slow and sticky. I needed to look at all of the providers. I took perhaps a slightly heretical view from one or two of my colleagues, which was that as far as I was concerned, it wasn't just about home ownership. If we were about building more homes, we had to think about all tenures. And although I think that's better accepted now in the political environment, there's some tension there. Nevertheless, making sure that each form, whether it's social, affordable, build to rent, home ownership, etc., all the different elements that come together, as Oliver Letwin's report identified, allows you to build more as a total. And that, I think, is the really important thing. So I tried to be tenure blind. I did launch the Help to Buy deposit scheme in the budget of 2013. But nevertheless, we did build to rent. We got a fantastic 5-year deal for the housing associations so that they were able to plan more consistently. And I roped in the sort of 20 mid-sized schemes that got stuck for whatever reason, and got all the participants around the table and looked at how we unlocked those. So I very much, enjoyed rolling my sleeves up and getting my hands dirty, as it were.
Mm. And in all of that, industry is not, in our view at least, the whole solution to solving the challenge of building more homes. Is that a view that you share? Did you fight for more government investment or more money to local authorities to support social housing?
Yeah, very much so. So, one of the things the Housing Association said to me right from the minute they started, David Orr was then running the NHF, and said, look, we only get 3-year deals. Well, in housing, you barely started a 3-year arrangement on rents before you're having to plan for the next one. Can we extend that? So that was the first thing I had to weigh in with both Treasury and Cabinet Office to get a proper 5-year deal, allowing them to plan and therefore to have 3 out of the 5 years at high levels rather than 1.5 of the 3 years. It's that planning, because politics tends to work on a short time scale, housing works on a longer one. So that was the first thing, I think. I think then also making sure that some of the arrangements in terms of the financial controls of the housing associations were sensible, because we don't want them to be in financial difficulties, but just making sure that actually some of the rules that inhibited their ability to build more homes were modernized. And so there are things like that you can do, as well as the Affordable Loans Guarantee Scheme, the original one, and the private rented sector loan guarantee scheme. To be fair, the Treasurer at the time, I think, with George Osborne and Danny Alexander, the Conservative senior participants, were very pro thinking about longer term options. So persuading them, Terry Alifat, my excellent Director of Housing, and I, we managed to persuade the rest of government to do what was effectively an £11 billion loan guarantee commitment, and that, I think, gave the industry confidence that we were heading in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. And in that sort of cacophony of different voices coming at you, individual companies, trade associations, stakeholders, with a view about housing, even if they're not deliverers of housing, how did you do that process of cutting through? How did you make sure you were? I suppose, firstly, understanding who the key players were, and secondly, then kind of identifying within all the different messages they were firing at you where the evidence lay. I know you had your civil servants to help you with that, but how does that process work?
I think watchers of West Wing will know that the best decisions made are the ones where the advisors actually have different opinions, and that flushes out the actual truth, because people will come to any issue with a particular perspective. So having a robust discussion around the table actually allows for good decision making. And I certainly tried to make sure that I wasn't just getting a consensual view around the table, because that always makes, particularly if everybody has a similar background and interest, you start thinking, what am I missing? So I think it helped enormously having a background. I understood the technicalities, and some of the traps it's easy to fall into if you don't necessarily understand property rights and all of that kind of stuff. And so that helped me be a reasonably good judge, I hope, of the information that was being presented to me, of the different opinions, understanding why they had that opinion, and indeed what the background was. And then, in the end, your job as a minister is to govern, is to decide, is to choose. And so you have the range of options, very often between the difficult one and the really difficult one. And you've got to make sure, my focus was, how do I make sure I build more homes so people can afford, to live in their area? And what can we do, not just in the southeast, but right across the country. And that was always a bit of a challenge. But I enjoyed it. We did manage to get. Tricky thing with housing is whatever you do in this year, it won't become obvious as to the outcomes until probably the middle of next year, by which time you've been booted out and moved somewhere else. And so the glory goes to your successor. But, that's life.
So thank you to Rodney Towson for asking a question, and please do feel free to join in by putting your questions on the Q&A function online. So Rodney, this is something that didn't come across your desk in your time, Mark. Government are pushing for removal of Section 21 for evictions, but the courts are overwhelmed with an expected increase in rental demand. What should government do to help landlords recover their properties in a timely way?
I think the problem with kicking the deadline down the alley, as it were, the can down the alley, has been a problem. There has to come a point at which the current prevention from landlords legitimately being able to challenge a tenant who is not paying or is breaching their covenant in any other sort of way, or indeed where legitimately as a family the owner needs to take back possession. I think the government needs to end the continuing delay and make sure there's a clarity there. Resources will have to be put into the courts, and that's a big challenge because it's not just property issues, it's a wider thing. I think also there is, and this is perhaps one of the more challenging areas, there is still a perception outside of property that the word landlord can immediately be equated to somebody who is extraordinarily rich and uncaring. And, there are many different landlords as there are many different tenants. And I think there's just a problem with this. You'll know this in the commercial side, Melanie, I know, but, I think there is an issue there. The presumption is that landlords somehow are automatically wealthy and so on. And many people have some savings. They thought, what can I earn some money from? Because current accounts are hopeless in terms of any return. So I know I'll buy that small flat in a neighboring town, and that will be my pension. That has been the problem for people. So I think that's important. I would also personally, in a longer term reform, want to see us try and find a way so that people can invest in property through other investment means, so that we can put money into supply of more housing as investors, as retail investors, and not into the demand for it. Because what's happened is that the PRS side grew rapidly, often at the expense of first-time buyers. And actually, if we managed to find a way that people could put their savings into a reasonable fund that gives them a return that builds more homes, that would actually clinch the. I know I didn't have long enough to get to that issue when I was there, but I think that could be important.
Well, you segue nicely into a second question, which is landlords are now leaving the PRS after that sharp rise that you talked about, with a fall from over 21% in 2017 to under 18% last year. Now, I mean, I'd be interested to see your view whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the real part of the question is, what should the government do to encourage landlords to provide rental property as regulation and energy efficiency requirements rise? So as it becomes more onerous, effectively, to be a private landlord, how do we incentivize?
I think there's an issue for all of our existing building stock, when that is that it's now clear that if we're going to get anywhere near net zero as a nation, there's a substantial amount of retrofitting to do, including in the PRS sector. So I think they're going to have to look at some sensible incentives so that we can have a retrofitting exercise that makes reasonable sense, both for landlords, but also for homeowners. Heat pumps are a hugely expensive option. And the notion that people will just do that in the 32 million households that need it without some form of financial incentive, I think is unreasonable. So I think for PRS landlords, but for the existing housing stock as a whole, we need to look at some sensible carrots and sticks, mostly carrots, I think, so that we can retrofit the existing housing stock, bring it up to speed, both in terms of insulation issues, but also in terms of what the kind of energy we use and so on.
Why do you think it is that the government hasn't done more? I mean, it seems so obvious that that is right. And given how vanishingly small the window in which we have to take serious action on carbon is becoming, why do you think it is the government hasn't done more to take that head on?
It's hugely difficult and could prove, you can imagine you only need a week of the newspapers saying that every household is going to have to drum up £10,000, to imagine the pain that would create. I think, though, principally it's that they've been trying to work out what the overall picture is in terms of where do we go in net zero. And then inevitably, I'm afraid, both Brexit and then COVID has stretched the bandwidth of government's ability to deal with big issues, social care being a good example, this being a good example, that their ability to then drill down within Whitehall and get in under the skin of these issues and get into the details, I think has been severely limited. So there's a hell of a lot of catching up to do in that sense. I think also it tends to be that policies are focused on dealing with new build. And the presumption is because everything is about how many more homes can we build, there's a natural, perhaps, tendency to not necessarily focus on the fact that the existing housing stock is far bigger a problem than how many houses we build in the next 5 years. And I think so. I suspect it's bandwidth in the end.
I wanted to ask you, and we segued neatly into it because I think this would almost certainly be on the list. I wanted to ask you, what you think property owners, the property sector should be most focused on over the next period. What are the pressing priorities for us as a sector, would you say?
There's quite a few. I mean, we've touched on the environmental side, and we've touched on affordable housing. I think I would say there's a couple of things. I think, first of all, there is an education role with commentariat, as I call them, in the media and parliamentarians, about understanding the relationship and the potential that the built environment and the professionals involved can deliver. And that is something that you've worked on, which is reducing the conflict, as it were. I think then the second thing I would say is modernizing the sector. And I mean by that both embracing the technology, but also thinking, I think, a little bit more about how do we attract the brightest and best. And that does mean a more diverse sector, both in terms of gender and in terms of background and so on. So I think there's some important cultural issues there as well for the sector.
No, I think that must be right. We're coming towards the end of our session, unbelievably. So I think I will just ask one last question of you, which is, you've done both. So we've got some people starting their career in property on this webinar. So I suppose the question is, what's your advice to them? Is it property, politics, both? Try both. I mean, we talked a little bit about that interchange between the two, and the advantages of having people from outside, done other things, coming into politics. So, what's your advice to the people listening to the webinar about their future?
I'd go and do something you enjoy that isn't about politics. First of all, get a foundation. It's a risky business, politics. You might never make it, or you might be in for 3 or 4 years and out again. So get a foundation, and then with that foundation, if you are still interested, do get involved, whether it's as a civil servant or as a politician, nationally or locally. And because I think the process needs people who have a professional attitude and background, who understand the importance of the built environment. And Parliament could do with a lot more people who actually understand why property matters.
Of course, the industry needs those too, because it goes without saying we have the brightest investors within BPF Futures, and we need that talent in our industry too. But maybe there's room for a bit of knowledge transfer, but both ways along the way.
Absolutely.
Mark, thank you. That's been a half hour that's gone in a flash, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you hugely to you for joining us. And just a reminder to our audience that our next Fireside chat is with the Government's Chief Property Officer, Janet Young, on the 2nd of June at 2 o'clock. So I hope you can join me in the BPF then. Thank you all very much for joining us today.